this started. No, yes, Hypersys core team. I think we have like one or two others joining as well, which is wonderful. And I think we can actually like just like continue the discussion that we had before, just with a camera and a microphone and a screen, and potentially just like put also some things on the document already, which might kind of map out the public goods ecosystem that we kind of have already. And maybe we can do that in a format that we can also then think of like it's the first step towards what we discussed earlier as potentially a hyper team, where we have like a mission, a clear goal, and a clear proposal of how do we work together. So I put the link to the document already in the Telegram chat. And my first suggestion is like, just like, I mean, this shouldn't take much time, putting down the organizations and the programs that we have today in the PLN, including kind of the core organizations. I mean, the core organizations that came out of network goods, but then also the extended network, and then go from there. Let's take a few minutes for that. So I think that we can also add, if we know organizations that should be kind of in the Protocol Labs network, what are the superpowers of each of the organizations? Right, I feel like these are kind of the core organizations that we have.
What are other organizations?
I feel like we can also come up with other organizations. I mean, like to some extent, even like Optimism RetroPGF is like in the extended network as well, I would say. And everybody who like works with RetroPGF, I think it's interesting to like list them as like extended network or like connected organizations maybe. I think this is like a good list of like the things that we have in the Protocol Labs network, specifically also for how we fund open source software, because like there's like I think more organizations if we look, for example, for ecological impact, than like from Hypersys we're working with some others, but I think it's like better to like leave it with like core for the PLN. Okay, so we have like now some of the functions in the network that we have, but when we map out like what we actually want to do and what's necessary, potentially we will see that some functions are not covered by any of the organizations yet. So I think that would be like good to have in mind, and then that could lead to the conclusion some other organizations that fulfill those functions should be actually in the network. So let's see if we come up with those in a minute. When we have programs, I mean, a program for public goods funding right now that runs is the RetroPGF. What are other programs that are actively funding public goods right now that we have in the PLN? I mean, we had the nucleation grants. I think that's to some extent part of it.
Yeah, I think like everything's changeable through FIPS, right? And on-chain incentives are actually a big part of this. And I think one of the things that we're starting to think about in a different way in some recent discussions that we had with the Optimism folks is to think about token allocation more broadly as opposed to individual programs.
Yep.
So airdrops are part of that, right? And on-chain incentives are part of that.
Yeah, you know, glyph staking rewards.
Exactly.
Yeah,
I mean, I would even say mining
rewards.
rewards. Yeah, like mining rewards are a big part of the allocation.
It's a quick recap. We just like mapped out like the organizations that are actually in the PLN, and then now talking about the programs that we have. And maybe a question from that is that follows. Like, yeah, we can also list like some previous programs if we want to. But what are the programs that we kind of want to see and that they are not there yet? So I think we like earlier already like talked about that a little bit, about like how would we actually like design the full cycle with the organizations that we have, and maybe that is like kind of the next step of like how do we actually imagine the incentives to flow from like what do we actually want to achieve, and I think this is like what we get into with Clara at 3:30, but maybe we can like map out how we think about these pieces fitting together already a little bit.
So PL libp IPFS. So let's call it IPFS Core Fund, libp Core Fund, PL Impact Fund, and PL FIF. PL FIF is PL Filecoin Impact Fund.
I was suggesting to Ray that we talked about coming up with what the hyper team would look like and what they would do. It feels like that could be a nice extension of this.
Yes.
So if we zoom out and say 10 years from now, there's going to be $1 trillion flowing through this economy. What's kind of the core infrastructure that you need, and at what point, what are the essential elements? And then over time, as the amount of funding scales, what allows you to really capture significant economies of scale?
Yeah. Is there a specific starting point that you would use? For example, we could use, let's suppose we actually have hypersets to tokenize the impact of projects. And then if we would have that, how do we do kind of like the financing and the outcome funding? And how we bring that together and what pieces are necessary for that?
I would even start one level above, like a builder registry, that kind of a basic structure that says, and some of this already exists right now, but here's how you define the ecosystem. Here are the builders in the ecosystem that we care about, and here's how new people enter the ecosystem.
The equivalent of OP Atlas, right? The equivalent of OP Atlas. It could be it could be all hypercerts, right? That's totally fine.
What the PL directory is doing is a pretty good starting point for that.
That is, yes.
Yeah.
Okay. So specifically for the builders that are then eligible for any of the blue funds to some extent. That's what we want to tag. Like these are programs that should be funded somehow through blue funds. Yep. So it's in that way the blue teams. Yeah.
Another thing that Anuj is asking for is kind of mapping all the hackathon recipients over time. I think that's a missing area.
The two analogs here are one open collective with tokenized work impact. So that idea. And the second one is how issuer of carbon credits actually issue carbon credits for a lot of different projects. So that is unfortunately some kind of a centralization, actually in both cases. But it actually takes away a lot of the work from the projects. And so there's like some legal stuff to figure out, but that is kind of like what we have discussed. Could be quite an unlock for all the other funding mechanisms afterwards.
So earlier I was getting the demo of Husky that they've been working on. I kind of feel like you could have agents creating the hypercerts, and then there could be some negotiation among them about what are the best arrangements of work and contributions and impact claims. Because like the work of going in and creating all of your hypercerts is actually probably pretty tedious.
Why is that not just built into like the RetroPGF?
The RetroPGF or
structure? Like fundamentally, there is separately the idea of what you apply RetroPGF to, and the mechanism that you use to actually achieve that goal, right? And
I think you're well. So currently we don't have a PL RetroPGF program.
we should.
We could.
That's effectively what you're. I think that's effectively what you're suggesting, right? Or is it not?
Well, I think you're using, and this is kind of what I was talking to Jonas about yesterday. I think you're currently using the name RetroPGF to just mean any retro funding of any nature with any algorithm.
Yes.
But in practice, OP retro funding implemented a very specific set of algorithms, and like I don't agree with in the PL network calling retro funding everything that is run by one team. Like retro funding is a category of algorithms and a category of mechanisms.
Right.
And you have different programs that are retro funding programs.
Yeah.
And so what I call an impact evaluator is just like we create a little program that just orients towards those KPIs.
Yep.
And I just wouldn't call that a RetroPGF round.
Okay.
And I wouldn't, like I think this confusion stems from OP choosing the name RetroPGF to describe a specific type of round and not giving it a different name.
But do you think, I'm curious how much we should be how much is there consolidation versus experimentation, right? Like how much of this is every single retro type round, impact evaluator type round, building their own tooling to test with like different types of parameters and different ways to structure it, and how much of it is, we actually try to unify some set of things, like either the hypercerts or either the impact evaluation part of it, or the the funding network or something like that.
Yep.
And then you fork and tweak.
I want small composable mechanisms
Yeah.
that anyone can add to, and then we just tune the weights in the neural net. And the way that retro PGF inspired programs run is that it's like one particular program run by one group of people. It's not very composable. It's not very easy to change. It's not very composable.
Yes.
And so that's one mechanism. There's one program, one mechanism. And when I hear let's add retro PGF to PL, I think let's create a structure with a set of badge holders that get to vote on.
No, I'm not.
No,
saying
I
that.
understand that's not what you mean,
Yeah.
but that's what the market understands that to mean
Fair enough.
because of how the program ran and how it works.
Yeah.
And so I think if you want to change that, then you need to give names and labels to the algorithms and say what OP retrofunding means is just the general practice of using funding in this retrospective sort of way. Now, under that, we have a number of different mechanisms, namely, I guess, 3 that you've been trying, maybe 2. One was name the batch holder round thing, give it a name so that people can describe that. And then now the second one that you tried with like the impact metrics, give that a name.
Yeah.
And if you try a different thing, give that a name. All of those different mechanisms are mechanisms under retrofunding.
Yeah.
And so in that sense, yeah, then I would be aligned with PL retrofunding would be a whole group of mechanisms that we may end up just using one because it's the one that works the best, but we should be able to know which mechanism that is. Like what's the implementation and why, and make sure that that's evolutionary, meaning somebody else should be able to walk up to the network and say, hey, I have a different retrofunding mechanism that I'm gonna run, and it's gonna work this way. And they should be able to like have a lot to get started to just do that.
Yeah.
And if we see that that performs better, then we just tune the weights.
I think I like that you're describing this. Yeah, I like what you just said. I'm curious how much it makes sense. It's more like there's a set of rails, like there's that is relatively reusable. Like there's always going to be some notion of a project, and we probably want to have some mechanism that we can like divide impact and there's always going to be some mechanism that we're going to want for like payment rails, for example. Regardless of there's always going to be some mechanism by which we're going to want to set some kind of goal, whether it's to maximize like public goods or it's to maximize some network KPIs or something like that. In reality, what we're probably just describing is like the impact evaluator framework rails, right? And then there's different funding allocation algorithms that we want to give different names to.
Yeah.
Like,
yeah. I mean, I think impact evaluators are a bit of a confusing term right now.
right.
Partly because the name doesn't quite make sense, and second, while a batch holder round process is similar in spirit to what we've called an impact evaluator, in practice it functions very different than a block reward,
Yeah.
and has very different properties. And so I would not call that an impact evaluator exactly. I would say it's like impact evaluator like.
Okay.
And so very concretely, I would define an impact evaluator, and again, name needs to change, that construction as needing an identified KPI that you're trying to maximize, or set of KPIs that you're trying to maximize, an identified set of parties that can participate, and an identified like a concrete and predictable round structure that you commit to in the long term, and that you run for many rounds. And so I think like there are properties about how the OP retrofunding structure works today that I think make it impact evaluator like, but not exactly.
Yeah.
And so what I would like, so very concretely, what I would like, if we are going to make an impact evaluator, then we would literally put a pot of treasury on chain, and we would define a KPI,
Yeah.
and we define a round structure, and we would have an algorithm just runs. And everyone can like just, do what the algorithm needs. And the only thing we get to is to like not give it more money. but it's committed to it. Like it'll keep operating while there's money in it.
Yeah.
I'm curious.
So one distinction that I normally make is between funding mechanisms and
Yeah.
decision mechanisms, because like the funding mechanisms can be like prospective funding, grants, or retrospective, and retrospective can include milestone based, or can be like also like it can be a separate category. And then how do we make the decision on the funding? It's just like another piece of like composable component, and that can then be metrics based, community based, expert based, algorithm based, and I think this is a distinction that makes sense in my head. And then we can actually combine those like decision mechanisms also with prospective funding, because you can do all of these things also prospectively.
Yep.
Curious how you guys feel about like. Sounds like we need better names for everything, because there's things that are getting
Confused, yeah.
confused, and when you say one thing, people will hear something else. Like I'm imagining something kind of like a funding experimentation framework. Let's call it FEF for now, right? Which is kind of like you have certain set of rails that are common, like the project directory, the funding rails. You do want to be able to visualize all the funding flow, regardless of the program, all the funding flows into a particular project, their aggregate funding so far, how they're performing against different KPIs, things like that. But then there's the area where you actually want to be innovating and experimenting in a very modular way that plugs into this framework,
Yeah.
right? Whether it's impact evaluators or badge holder voting or whatever we're doing, there'll be retro funding now.
I think you're describing both what Gitcoin has tried to do, and you're describing what Allo is trying to do now. But I think that, and I think that could be a good direction. Like we could adopt Allo and just use it for a bunch of these mechanisms. And I want to try that. Like I want to, because both I want to support Allo as a project and a program, because if it can figure things out, awesome. And B, because it'll solve some like real pain points. But factor in that there will come some set of people who want to make a thing that Allo doesn't support or that Gitcoin doesn't support, and they need to be able to create their thing and hook into those rails. And so if that's what happens, then you need a separate thing that is just observing all these things and integrating metrics.
Yeah.
That is not enforcing you must do this way. It's rather you have a way to export metrics to this thing.
Yeah.
And that's what I think like OSO could do.
Yeah, it's manual translation, but it's a necessary evil in the sense that like forcing standardization never works, right?
It's not just a process of forcing standardization. You're asking them to refrain from having different feature sets
Yeah.
that the standard hasn't considered in order to get the benefits of network-wide visibility.
Right.
And those are two things. You should have one thing that makes it easy for you to like, one thing that gives you easy rails, and another thing that gets you visibility. So, for example, this is what happened with Ethereum and the other L1s. Like, a lot of the Ethereum community was like, well, if you want to use EVM and so on, you need to be on the Ethereum L1. And a lot of groups were like, no, but we want to do something very different. And so they ended up like creating their own L1s. And now that led to like this massive fragmentation because there wasn't a good standardization process about addresses.
Right.
And so today we're living with this like perfectly predictable problem about the confusion that is going to be bred by not putting good thought into how you do addressing schemes and cross-chain calling conventions and all of that kind of stuff. And we literally discussed that in 2014 and 2015. And I remember being in multiple conversations with like, guys, like you have to do the standardization ahead of time because people will not just go into your network. They're going to make their own network using parts of the stuff. Didn't do that. And now, I feel kind of personally responsible for not doing what I could to like inflict
there is an Ethereum interoperability forum happening this weekend. So
yeah, but like, it's like you now have people with wallets who have to worry about selecting network and then L1 or L2, and people have to have money on Optimism, and they have to worry about moving money from that to that. And so in this case, if we force people to use one platform, we will end up with that because people will like fork the platforms and change them, and then nothing will interop.
Yep.
And so I think we should separate the concerns and say one part is you have a toolbox of rails that are helpful, a separate and that follow some standardized way of reporting on their thing, and then a wholly separate thing is aggregating metrics and visualization of all of the available things.
Yeah.
And and like if you want to report your thing to this metrics thing, here's how you do it. Here's an API.
Yeah, fair enough.
When you brought up Allo, so is Allo for you one part of like an interchangeable component, or like?
Yeah, I think Allo is a network that is building a set of rails to create interchangeable components to enable a large network to emerge of these mechanisms. And so it's making it easy to generate a lot of mechanisms. But I'm saying that necessarily it cannot possibly be the only one. And
Yep.
people will do other weird custom things. And so if you just support Allo and nothing else, then you're going to miss a huge fraction of the stuff that's going on. And you're also going to inhibit experimentation. And so you just can't do that. You have to like support, you can strongly encourage Allo and you can strongly push people towards Allo, but that can't be the only mechanism.
Yeah. And we're already seeing this with project registries too, right? It's like there's the PLN directory, but then there's also OP Atlas, and then there's also the Gitcoin database. And
So on the experimentation side, the thing that I would be most excited about is if we really identify kind of when we have like the core KPIs, then design a program where we have like, okay, these are the potential recipients that like work towards like one of these goals. And then at the same time, actually have multiple different decision-making mechanisms. Like one is like just algorithm-based, one is expert-based, one is community-based, potentially like with QF. And then afterwards, we can actually compare these results. And also over time, we will then be more able to actually analyze which of these decision-making mechanisms actually predicted the best, which of these teams were successful. And of course, there's like the people with more money potentially also succeed, but that is like inherent in this experimentation.
Yep.
But still, if we run the same decision-making mechanisms at the same time on the same set of projects, then I think we can like iterate faster, and then we can also invite other funders to, okay, you have the choice. You can put your money into each of these decision-making mechanisms to distribute your money. So basically, the funders can have the choice between the mechanisms at the time of the funding, and in that way, we can actually run a lot of experimentation inside one like capital allocation round.
I feel like one useful exercise would actually be to shortlist the mechanisms that would be most beneficial to support this out of the box. So we've talked a lot about fill retroactive. If there was like a top 3 or so, what would those be? Because if we overfit it just for one mechanism, then immediately things are going to go. Others will continue developing.
Can I maybe show you some graphs of where I've done some of that so you can get a sense
Yes,
of like
please.
where they emerge? And then second, let me show you the KPIs. So let me grab my laptop.
Yeah, I think the KPIs was actually something that we discussed before. That's actually where we wanted to start, but we didn't have them. So wonderful.